40 years, the cure existed. It was cheap. It was widely available. It was sitting in clinics and hospitals across the United States. A simple injection of penicillin. One shot. That is all it would have taken. The United States government knew this, and they chose not to give it. Between 1932 and 1972, 600 black men in rural Alabama were enrolled in a secret government study. 399 of them had syphilis. They were told they were being treated for bad blood. They were not being treated for anything. They were being watched, observed, as the disease slowly destroyed their bodies, their minds, and their families. By the time it ended, 128 men had died of syphilis or its complications. 40 of their wives had been infected. 19 of their children were born with the disease. This was not a mistake. This was a decision. Made deliberately. Maintained deliberately. For 40 years. This is the Tuskegee Experiment, and it is the most shameful chapter in the history of American medicine. To understand what made this possible, you need to understand who these men were and the world they lived in. Macon County, Alabama, 1932. The Great Depression has shattered the American economy. In this corner of the rural South, the men are sharecroppers. They farm land they will never own, for wages that barely feed their families. Many have never seen a doctor in their lives. Medical care is not something poor black men in Alabama in 1932 could simply access. And then the government arrived. Men in white coats, official-looking, authoritative, offering something extraordinary: free medical care, free meals, free burial insurance for their families when they died. For men who had nothing, this felt like a miracle. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a term commonly used in the area to describe a range of ailments, including fatigue, anemia, and general sickness. It was vague enough to mean anything, specific enough to feel reassuring. They trusted the doctors. They climbed into the government vehicles. They showed up for their appointments. They rolled up their sleeves when asked. They believed that the most powerful government on earth had looked at their suffering and decided to help. They were wrong. The doctors were not there to heal them. They were there to watch them die. The official name of the program was the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. Read that name again. Untreated. That word was always there, written into the title. The intention was never hidden, not from the scientists, not from the government officials who funded it, only from the men it was being done to. The study was run by the United States Public Health Service, a federal government agency. It was conducted on the campus of the Tuskegee Institute, a respected black educational institution whose cooperation gave the experiment a veneer of legitimacy. The men were given physical examinations, x-rays, spinal taps, a deeply painful procedure that involves inserting a long needle into the spine to extract fluid. They were told the spinal taps were a special free treatment. They were not a treatment. They were a diagnostic procedure done purely for the benefit of the study. They were given aspirin and vitamins, placebos, designed to make them believe they were receiving real medical care. They received nothing that would have actually treated their disease. And here is the detail that makes this unforgivable. By 1943, penicillin had become the established treatment of choice for syphilis. It was working. It was curing people. It was widely available across the United States. The men of Tuskegee were not offered it, not because it was unavailable, not because it was untested, because giving it to them would have ended the study, and the study was more important to them than the men. Keeping 400 men unknowingly enrolled in a fatal study for 40 years required effort. It required systems. It required people. This did not run itself. When World War II began and draft boards ordered some of the study participants to report for induction, and some were told to get syphilis treatment as a condition of military service, the United States Public Health Service intervened directly with the draft boards to block their enlistment and to block their treatment. They could not allow these men to accidentally receive penicillin in military service. When one single man managed to see a doctor outside of Tuskegee who correctly diagnosed him and gave him a shot of penicillin, that outside doctor was called before the Centers for Disease Control and reprimanded. They told him he had ruined their study and jogged their statistics. They were angry that a dying man had received medicine. A nurse named Eunice Rivers worked as the primary liaison between the study and its subjects for most of its 40-year duration. She was black. She drove the men to appointments. She brought them food. She was the familiar, trusted face that kept them coming back. She was an instrument of the deception, though historians debate how much she truly understood about what was being done to the men she cared for. And through it all, the men kept coming, because they trusted her, because they trusted the government, because nobody had ever given them reason not to. That trust was the weapon used against them. Peter Buxton was 28 years old when he first heard about Tuskegee. He was working as a public health investigator for the federal government in San Francisco. During his lunch break one day, he overheard colleagues talking about an ill and insane man who had been taken by his family to see a doctor outside of Tuskegee. The doctor gave him penicillin, and that doctor was subsequently reprimanded by the CDC for ruining their study. Buxton was dumbfounded. He pulled the files. He read everything. And what he found was not a misguided study that had gotten out of hand. It was a deliberate, ongoing program in which American citizens were being watched as they died from a curable disease, and every attempt to treat them was being actively suppressed. Buxton wrote a formal report comparing the Tuskegee study to the Nazi medical experiments exposed at the Nuremberg doctors' trials of 1947. His immediate supervisor's response was chilling. The supervisor said, "I'll send your report up the line, but remember I have a wife and kids. Please forget my name when they ask you why you did this." Another colleague dismissed his report as trash, insisting the men were all volunteers. He reported his concerns. He was ignored. He reported again. He was dismissed. For years, Peter Buxton tried to end the Tuskegee study through proper channels. For years, the proper channels simply absorbed his complaints and continued the study. In the early 1970s, Buxton took his documents to a journalist. The story was published on July 25, 1972 by the Associated Press. It ran in newspapers across the country. Public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. By the time the story broke, only 74 of the original test subjects were still alive. 74. Out of 399 men with syphilis, 74 were still breathing when the world finally found out what had been done to them. The Tuskegee study was shut down in October 1972. Senator Edward Kennedy convened congressional hearings. He called the experiment outrageous and intolerable. The United States Public Health Service issued a response. They said, and these are their words, that doctors and civil servants had simply done their job, many of them for the glory of science. For the glory of science. That was their defense. A class action lawsuit was filed. The surviving participants and the families of those who died received a settlement of $10 million. The 74 surviving men finally received penicillin along with the 40 wives and 19 children who had contracted the disease. The money divided among hundreds of victims and families came to approximately $37,000 per surviving participant. $37,000. For 40 years of deliberate infection, for the deaths of 128 men, for the suffering of their wives, for the children born carrying a disease they should never have had. Not one doctor was prosecuted. Not one government official was charged. Not one person who ran this study for 40 years faced any criminal consequence whatsoever. In 1997, 25 years after the study ended, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology. He called it shameful. He said the United States government had done something profoundly, morally wrong, clearly racist. 8 of the original survivors were still alive to hear that apology. 8 men who had spent decades waiting for their government to acknowledge what it had done to them. They sat in the White House and they listened to a president say sorry, and then they went home. The Tuskegee Experiment did not end in 1972. Not really. Its shadow is still here. Study after study has shown that Black Americans, particularly Black men, are statistically less likely to trust medical institutions, less likely to seek preventative care, less likely to enroll in clinical trials. Researchers call it medical mistrust. Historians know exactly where it comes from. Vanessa Northington Gamble, a professor of medical humanities at George Washington University, has said that the Tuskegee study tapped into a deep and justified outrage, and that it has led to a lingering mistrust of the healthcare system, particularly among Black Americans, that persists to this day. People die from that mistrust, real people, today. Because the damage done between 1932 and 1972 did not stop when the study stopped. And here is what I cannot move past. This study was not secret. During its 40-year run, approximately a dozen peer-reviewed medical journal articles were published about the Tuskegee study. The American medical community read them, reviewed them, cited them, and raised no meaningful objection. The entire medical establishment looked at what was being done to these men and called it science. Peter Buxton, the man who finally ended it, compared it to Nazi medical experiments. His supervisors called his report trash. He was right. They were wrong. And it took 40 years and 128 deaths for the world to agree. The Tuskegee Experiment was not an accident of history. It was a choice made by educated people, funded by the government, published in respected journals, and protected by an institution that decided some lives were worth less than data. That institution still exists. Think about that. One box, one whistleblower, one journalist. That is all that stands between you and never knowing. This has been Hollow Cure. Subscribe, because we are not done.